Putin just offered to help the United States handle Iran's enriched uranium. Let that sentence land for a moment. The president of Russia, whose country is supplying Iran with goods and intelligence throughout 62 days of this war, called the President of the United States on April 29th and offered to personally manage the disposition of Iran's nuclear material. And Trump turned him down. Trump said, "Before you help us with Iran, I want you to end your war in Ukraine." And Putin, according to everyone who was in that call, heard that and said, essentially, we can discuss that too. And somewhere in that 90-minute exchange, which Russia described as frank and businesslike, notable that they did not say friendly, the entire strategic picture of this conflict shifted in a way that almost nobody covering it is prepared to explain accurately. So let me try, because what happened on that call is not what either government is telling you publicly. And understanding the gap between the official version and the operational reality is the difference between watching this war and actually understanding where it ends. Let me start with what we know happened in the 72 hours surrounding that call, because the sequencing matters enormously. On April 28th, one day before Putin picked up the phone to talk to Trump, Iranian Foreign Minister Araghchi flew to Saint Petersburg and met personally with Putin at the Boris Yeltsin Presidential Library. That meeting covered, according to Iran's own foreign ministry, detailed discussions on the war and the aggression by the United States and Israel. Araghchi briefed Putin on the entire diplomatic architecture, the Pakistan mediation, Iran's proposals for Hormuz, Iran's red lines on the nuclear question. He essentially gave Putin a full operational briefing on exactly where Iran stands and what Iran needs from the negotiating process. And then 24 hours later, Putin called Trump. That is not a coincidence. That is a diplomatic sequence. Putin met with the Iranian foreign minister, received Iran's full picture, and then used that information as the foundation for a conversation with Trump about how to end a war that Trump is losing. And he did it with enough strategic elegance that Trump described it afterward as a very good call and said he thinks Putin wants to be helpful. Think about what Russia actually accomplished in those 2 days. Putin established himself as the party with the most complete picture of what Iran will and will not accept. Putin established himself as the only leader who has direct, trusted access to Iranian decision makers at the foreign minister level. Putin positioned himself as an indispensable mediator in a conflict where the United States has no direct communication channel to Tehran that Iran trusts. And Putin did all of this without committing to anything, without abandoning any of Russia's existing relationships, and without giving Trump anything more than a phone call. Now, let me address what Putin actually offered on the Iran nuclear question, because that offer has been dramatically undercovered in the American press. Putin told Trump he would like to be involved with the enrichment, meaning Russia would be willing to take custody of Iran's enriched uranium stockpile and manage it under some form of international arrangement. On the surface, that sounds like a Russian concession. Look more carefully. Russia taking custody of Iran's enriched uranium is not Russia pressuring Iran. It is Russia inserting itself as the permanent, indispensable broker between Iran's nuclear program and the Western demands that Iran dismantle it. If Russia controls the enrichment arrangement, Russia controls the leverage. Russia becomes the country that can escalate or de-escalate the nuclear question depending on whether its other interests, Ukraine sanctions, NATO expansion, economic relationships are being served. Putin was not offering Trump a solution. Putin was offering Trump a dependency. And Trump turned it down, which means Trump does not yet understand what was being offered. The Kremlin's description of the call as frank is the diplomatic language for, we had a difficult conversation in which the Russian side communicated things the American side did not want to hear. Frank in Kremlin vocabulary means there was disagreement that was expressed clearly and professionally. It means Putin said things that did not make Trump feel good. It means the Russian side did not soften its assessment of where this war is going to accommodate the American president's self-image. Now, let me tell you what I believe Putin actually communicated on that call based on what Russia has said publicly, what Araghchi discussed in Saint Petersburg, and what the operational situation on the ground actually shows. Putin communicated that the American position in this conflict is deteriorating in ways that the American public is not being told about. He communicated that Iran is not going to capitulate. He communicated that the Strait of Hormuz will not be opened by military force at any troop level the United States is capable of deploying in any relevant time frame. He communicated that the Russian-Iranian Strategic Framework Agreement, which Iran finally ratified after the June 2025 conflict, gives Russia a legal basis for deepening its support for Iran that the United States cannot simply demand Russia abandon. And he communicated that if Trump wants Russia's help getting to a negotiated exit from this conflict, Russia will need something in return. That something is Ukraine, and that is why Trump's public response to the call was so revealing. Trump said, "I told him I'd rather have you involved with ending the war in Ukraine." Trump redirected the conversation away from Iran toward Ukraine, not because Trump is more concerned about Ukraine than Iran, but because Trump understands that what Putin was describing is a trade, Russian assistance with Iran exit in exchange for American flexibility on Ukraine. And Trump is not ready to say that publicly because saying it publicly means acknowledging that the United States needs Russian help to exit a war the United States started. That is the admission that cannot be made before the political conditions that allow it are in place. I want to tell you a story about what strategic patience actually looks like. In December 2025, 91 drones targeted Vladimir Putin in an assassination attempt that the Kremlin said was guided by CIA intelligence. Russia did not retaliate against the United States directly. In March 2026, Great Britain attacked the Votkinsk strategic facility using a Flamingo missile that British officials essentially confirmed was British designed. 7 Storm Shadow missiles have since struck Bryansk. Russia has not struck British factories. Russia has not struck the Storm Shadow production facility that under international law of armed conflict would be a legitimate target. And the reason Russia has not struck these targets is the same reason Russia has not directly intervened in the Iran war on the side of its treaty partner, because strategic patience is winning. Keir Starmer's government is in political freefall. The British economy is under severe energy stress. Every week Russia does nothing to Britain is another week the British political system collapses under its own weight. You do not need to strike a man who is walking toward a cliff. You wait. The same logic applies to the Iran war. Russia has been Iran's strategic partner for decades. The Strategic Framework Agreement that Iran finally ratified after the June 2025 conflict gives Russia the legal foundation to deepen that partnership in ways that the United States cannot sanction its way out of. Russia has been patient, and patience just delivered a phone call from the American president asking for help. Now let me address the oil dimension because it is the specific mechanism through which Russia's strategic position in this conflict is strongest and through which the Trump-Putin dynamic is most clearly being driven by economic reality. Before this war, Russia was selling its Urals-grade crude oil at a discount of approximately $23 below market price because of Western sanctions. As of this week, with Iran war driving oil above $100 per barrel and the United States having lifted some Russian oil sanctions as part of the economic pressure management, Russia is selling that same oil at roughly $80 on the open market. That is a profit margin improvement of approximately $57 per barrel. On Russian export volumes of approximately 5 million barrels per day, that represents an additional revenue stream of $285 million per day, which means every day this Iran war continues and oil prices stay elevated, Russia is collecting an economic windfall that it did not need to fire a single missile to achieve. Trump initiated the call to Putin. That is the detail that matters most, and that has been the least adequately analyzed. The United States called Russia, not the other way around. When the stronger party in a negotiation picks up the phone first, it signals need. It signals that the party making the call has a problem that the party receiving the call can help solve. Putin did not need this call. Putin's economic position is improving daily. Putin's ally Iran is holding the line militarily. Putin's strategic position in Ukraine is advancing while American attention is focused on the Persian Gulf. From Putin's perspective, the optimal outcome is to let this situation run as long as possible while the American position deteriorates further. And while Russia's economic and strategic gains accumulate, the fact that Trump called him means Trump is feeling the pressure. The midterm elections are 6 months away. The GOP majority in both the House and Senate is at risk, according to polling. That shows Democrats with a 10-point advantage. Gas prices are the single most visible economic pain point for American voters. And the gas price is determined in significant part by what happens in the Strait of Hormuz. Putin controls a lever that affects the Hormuz situation, the oil price, the American domestic political calendar, and Trump's re-election positioning all simultaneously. And Trump called him. Let me now address what happened in the same 48-hour window on the Iranian side. Because Araghchi's trip to Saint Petersburg was not just a briefing session. It was Iran communicating to Russia, and through Russia to the United States, that Iran has a specific proposal on the table that the American side is failing to engage with seriously. Iran's proposal, confirmed by CNN and multiple other sources as of April 28th, is a staged process. Phase 1. Reopen the Strait of Hormuz without restrictions or tolls. Return to pre-war status quo on the ground. Restore the ceasefire, fully including Lebanon. Phase 2. Begin structured negotiations on the nuclear question with IAEA monitoring. Iranian enrichment at civilian necessary levels, international verification. That is not a maximalist Iranian demand. That is essentially the JCPOA framework dressed in language that doesn't require either side to say they are returning to Obama's deal. It is face-saving architecture for both governments, and Trump reportedly told his national security team on April 28th that he is unlikely to accept it. Why? Because Phase 1 gives Iran what Iran needs. Hormuz reopened. Sanctions relief begins. Regional ceasefire. Without Iran having given up the nuclear question that Trump has publicly committed to resolving. Accepting Iran's staged proposal means Trump gets a functional ceasefire and Hormuz reopening, but does not get the nuclear surrender. He has been demanding publicly since before the war began, which means Trump cannot describe it as achieving the war's stated objectives, which means he cannot sell it to his base as a victory, which means the political conditions for accepting a deal have not yet been manufactured. This is the pattern that has defined this entire conflict from the opening hours. The military situation argues for accepting available terms. The political calendar demands that those terms be reframed as American victory before they can be accepted. And the gap between the operational reality and the political requirement is filled with additional weeks of blockade, additional press conferences, additional Trump Truth Social posts about how Iran must cry uncle. Iran is not crying uncle. Iran's foreign minister used a specific phrase in Saint Petersburg that I want to flag because it is the most precise description of American behavior in this conflict that any party has produced. Araghchi said Washington's destructive habits include insisting on unreasonable demands, frequently changing positions, using threatening rhetoric, and repeatedly breaching commitments. That is a legal brief, not a diplomatic complaint. He is building the record of American bad faith for the international community. He is documenting in formal diplomatic language delivered to a permanent member of the UN Security Council the specific pattern of behavior that justifies Iran's refusal to make further concessions without guarantees that Washington cannot currently provide. Russia heard that brief, and Russia is now in the position of being the party that both sides trust enough to communicate through, which means Russia is in the driver's seat, not because Russia has military power in this theater, because Russia has diplomatic legitimacy that the United States has systematically destroyed through the very habits Araghchi just cataloged. The call on April 29th was Trump acknowledging, without saying so, that the United States needs a broker, and the only broker with access to Iran credibility in the Gulf, and the economic leverage that comes from controlling energy supply is Russia. That is the strategic picture as of May 1st, 2026. The United States called Russia. Putin offered to help with Iran's nuclear material. Trump redirected to Ukraine. And somewhere between those two governments, the shape of the deal that ends this war is being negotiated in a language that neither side can say publicly yet. Watch what happens on May 9th, Victory Day in Russia. Putin proposed a Ukraine ceasefire to coincide with it. If Trump agrees, even to a symbolic ceasefire, that is Trump beginning to pay the price of Russian assistance with Iran. And if the Ukraine ceasefire holds for even a week, the diplomatic trade that was initiated in that 90-minute frank phone call will have its first visible result. I want to add one final piece of analysis that nobody else is doing because it requires holding several moving parts simultaneously. Trump acknowledged this week that he believes Russia is helping Iran. He said it on a radio interview with Fox News host Brian Kilmeade. He said, yeah, we're helping Ukraine and they're helping Iran. It's like they do it and we do it. That is a remarkable statement. The American president is publicly acknowledging that the war his administration launched against Iran is being contested by the same adversary whose intelligence capabilities he asked his own special envoy to warn off. Witkoff told reporters on April 30th that Russia said they have not been sharing intelligence with Iran. Trump simultaneously said on radio that he thinks they are. The American president and his own special envoy gave contradictory public statements about Russian intelligence sharing with Iran within 24 hours of each other. That is not strategic ambiguity. That is an administration that does not have a coherent assessment of the most important intelligence question in the current conflict. Russia is simultaneously helping Iran and promising not to. And the American response is, Witkoff says we can take them at their word while Trump says we think they're doing it anyway. Putin received 90 minutes of Trump's attention on April 29th. He used it well. The war in Iran does not end when the missiles stop. It ends when the political conditions are manufactured to allow the deal that is already mostly built in Islamabad to be signed in a way that both leaders can describe as victory. Russia is now the architect of those conditions, and the United States called them to ask for their help. 62 days into a war that was supposed to last 4 to 6 weeks. With 13 American service members dead, with the Strait of Hormuz still under Iranian operational control, with the interceptor stockpiles critically depleted, with every allied nation having declined to participate, with Democrats holding a 10-point polling advantage 6 months before midterm elections, with oil above $100 and gas prices landing in every American household every time someone fills a tank, In that context, the President of the United States picked up the phone and called the President of Russia. And the President of Russia took the call and described it afterward as frank and businesslike, not friendly, not warm, frank and businesslike. That is a man who knows he is holding the cards and is not going to pretend otherwise, just because the person calling him needs him to.